Hey guys, welcome to the Fish Room. I'm Rachel O'Leary and it's time for a Tuesday tip. I thought that this week we would start a new series on how to set up breeding tanks for various species. This week I'd like to talk about what's important in a shrimp tank. And in a few minutes I'll take you around the fish room and show you some of the strategies I use to breed shrimp. Now, the first thing you have to think about is tank size. Most people are really tempted to use very small tanks for shrimp. And while it's true they have a very low bioload, they're also extremely sensitive to swings in parameters. And a small tank with a small volume is prone to big shifts in parameters. Even minute amounts of ammonia or nitrite can be absolutely lethal to your entire colony of shrimp, and very quickly. For that reason, I really prefer to use big tanks for shrimp. Now, a lot of my shrimp tanks are 55-gallon, and I know that sounds absurd, but my goals are to have the highest yield with the least work possible. So it makes sense. A 10-gallon is an excellent choice for the average hobbyist to use for breeding shrimp. They can certainly be done in smaller tanks, but you have to be ever diligent to your water quality. The second thing that we need to talk about is substrate. Yes, no, what kind, and why? I like to use a little bit of substrate in my shrimp tanks. With Neocaridina, your cherries, your yellows, your oranges, your blues, your willies, I find that the shrimp really color up much better if you use a nice dark substrate. Some of my favorites are a fine black sand, even Eco Complete, really anything that has a nice vacuumable surface. If I'm working with something like crystal reds, crystal blacks, tigers, things like that, I like to use a soil like aqua soil or fluval stratum, as they provide a neutral hardness and pH for the shrimp, which is really important with those species. Now, I have both types of tanks set up here so I can show you both of that. It's extremely important that if you do choose to use substrate, you make sure that it's of a type that you can really maintain well. There's a big internet fad of saying that you don't have to maintain shrimp tanks, and I think that's a big mistake. Shrimp are very sensitive, they're messy eaters, they pick constantly. If you drop prepared foods in there, they're broken down into small pieces which get into the substrate. And that's not a huge problem until secondary pests like planaria, detritus worms, or even hydra crop up. And hydra and planaria specifically can be lethal to your shrimp, especially the young shrimp. So in my mind, it's important to be able to really well maintain your shrimp tanks. For that reason, I generally use a thin coating. It means it's easy for me to stir up with my chopsticks, suck up any detritus, and really just maintain excellent water quality. I also am prone to using feeding dishes, as I've talked to you guys about in the past. Now, I don't always leave these in the tank, I just use them when I feed, but I think that helps minimize some of the mess as well. Now, shrimp don't require hardscape or plants or even lighting. You know, they don't require any of this. What they need is good water and good food. However, I find that I get the best color, activity, behavior, and breeding when I provide them with a little bit of driftwood and specifically some leaf litter. Now, we've talked about leaf litter before and all its many benefits, and I think this is especially true for palliative care of stressed shrimp. I've seen it cure conditions like cloudy body or other bacterial type infections that shrimp are prone to. Shrimp can be very sensitive to medication, so this is a nice way to sort of boost their immunity and give them the best shot possible right from the get-go. Almond leaves are my favorite simply because they last a long time, they look nice, and they're thicker. Oak leaves or maple leaves, banana leaves, things like that, or mulberry, all work very well as also. Now, I am a big fan of plants, and especially in shrimp tanks, and there's a few reasons for this. One, quick growing plants that are still low light are your best line of defense to provide stable water chemistry. They absorb the ammonia out of the water and help prevent little swings in parameters in your tanks. They also provide lots and lots of grazing surfaces for our creatures, which means they're getting to eat all the time. In the wild, they are foragers, foraging constantly, picking. We should be able to duplicate that in our aquariums as well. It's not that hard. Pick easy plants like guppy grass, mosses, cryptocorns, java ferns, Anubias, Bucephalandras, really any of those things do very, very well. And they provide a great surface for our shrimp to eat. So let's take a look at some of my shrimp tanks and we can continue the discussion about the choices I've made there. Now you guys have seen this tank several times on my channel. I believe it's an 11-gallon True Aqua tank. And this one was set up deliberately for the Caridina shrimp, the crystal reds and the crystal blacks. And because of that, I chose to use two different soils in this tank. One is aqua soil and the other is Brightwell Florin. And it provides a nice neutral environment. Now the aqua soil specifically did have to be aged for about 5 weeks before I could add inhabitants because it also lets off ammonia. That's another important thing to remember. The shrimp are doing really, really well in this tank. I've cultivated probably thousands at this point out of this aquarium. But it's all low light plants. You can see there's Anubias, Cryptparva, some Bucephalandras, some narrow leaf Java fern, and some Bulbitis. All of these surfaces provide constant grazing areas for my shrimp, which means I don't have to supplement them with food as much, and I'm much less likely to get the secondary pests. Now this tank is more carefully aquascaped than the vast majority of my breeding tanks, and that's because I do not net in this tank very often. Generally, if I'm going to sell shrimp from this tank, I'll catch a large group at once and move them to a secondary tank. This is much more typical for one of my tanks set up specifically for breeding purposes. You can see that there's not a whole lot of controlled hardscape here. It's mainly a mass of low light plants, which in this case is subwassertang, guppy grass, and some Anubias. It's a large volume tank. This is a 55-gallon. It has a few pieces of driftwood and is really not that attractive. However, I breed a ton of shrimp in this tank with very little work. I do a 10% water change every 3 to 5 days, and that's it. So in this tank are my yellow shrimp. And I've been working with these particular shrimp for about 12 years now. And the line has just continued to grow, and I do call from time to time pulling out lesser quality species or lesser quality specimens. But for the most part, I always have a few hundred shrimp in this tank. They're always actively picking on the plants and generally doing what shrimp do. So it's not the most attractive of tanks, but it is very, very healthy for these shrimp. This is my Caridina Babalti green tank. Again, you can see it's extremely simple. It's got a piece of driftwood, some Bucephalandra, some Bulbitis, and a large mass of some sort of crypt that I don't remember what it is. There's also quite a bit of moss that covers the ground, and it has an extremely thin layer of substrate, perhaps 1/4 of an inch, just enough to cover the bottom. This makes it easy to net in this tank, to catch shrimp, to maintain it, and as well as providing them with tons and tons of grazing surfaces. Next to that one is my breeding tank for red realies. Now I have bred probably millions of these shrimp at this point, and again, this is a 20 long. It's got a large mass of subwassertang, some narrow leaf, and no substrate at all in this tank, just good clean water. This is another of my shrimp tanks. Now this one's very tiny. It's only about 2 gallons, and it's primarily for cherry shrimp, of which there are quite a few in here. This one I set up initially when I got in those disease shrimp in order to further their quarantine, and they've done so well I just left them in here. This tank is very atypical in my choice because it's so small. However, it just shows you that there's not one way to do this. There's lots of different ways to set up a shrimp tank, and this is working out perfectly well. It's got a lot of flame moss, some Anubias, and a bunch of Bucephalandra in there. So I hope taking a look at some of the different style tanks that I use specifically for breeding will help you guys realize that it doesn't have to be complicated, full of fancy products or specific items. Filtration is a big one. You want to make sure that you use a filter that is not dangerous to your shrimp. My preference is for sponge filtration. You want to provide adequate grazing surfaces, and then maintain your water well. Small, frequent water changes are the best thing for breeding shrimp. Thanks for watching. Make sure you stop by my Facebook as well as my website, MsJinx.com, where you can find my upcoming speaking engagements, my current stock list, and information on all things nano. Please let me know in the comment box below what other species you would like me to focus on for this breeding tank setup series.